From a commune near Montreal to a militant communist stronghold in Brooklyn, author Sonja Larsen grew up in the torrent of countercultural experimentation that flourished in the 1960s and 70s. She looks back at those heady days in her memoir, Red Star Tattoo, My Life as a Girl Revolutionary, and joins us now for more on the radical upbringing that shaped her young life. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Sonia Begonia. Now, last year I turned 40, and I think out of all the birthdays, it was the one that was kind of like really pivotal.
Yes.
40 was also pivotal for you.
It
Why?
absolutely was. I think it was this point where I realized that there were things that I hadn't done in my life because I was afraid, and I just thought 40 was a good time to sort of shed that fear and shed those expectations, I think. So.
And what were some of those things that you were afraid of?
I was afraid of talking, really sort of telling this whole story about my life. And so I realized that I really wanted, I had wanted to write. I had done some writing, but I also knew really from a pretty young age that if I was going to write, I was going to have to talk about my life. When I was 13, my mother said, oh yeah, we'll need writers to write about the revolution, after the revolution. So I kind of had this sense of this obligation, and at a certain point, I really embraced that in a way to say that I did want to tell this story. So.
And is that why you decided to write a memoir instead of writing a novel?
Yeah, it felt like that was sort of the elephant in the room. Like I couldn't really write a novel. I couldn't really write a novel that was stranger than the life that I'd led. And it seemed like an odd place to start with fiction when really there was so much about my own life that I hadn't really looked at or understood or examined in a really critical kind of way.
And it took you 8 years to write the book.
It did.
Why?
Oh, I think when you write a memoir, you have to kind of write it for yourself first, and then you have to sort of figure out how that's going to connect with readers. I think structurally there were a lot of confusing things about my life because there was so much detail. So, I've lived with probably, 200 people in my life. So to figure out who's going to be in this book and what stories are really the pivotal stories that explain some of the events in my life. Early readers were like, there's so many people named Patty in this book, I can't keep track. And there are. And so to try and figure that out and keep that clarity, I guess, for readers.
And do you also think maybe it was the emotional aspect of it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that at first, I was writing down these events, and I was at the writer's studio, the Simon Fraser University Writer's Studio, and people would say to me, well, why did these things happen? I was like, I don't know why they happened. I was 8. I don't know, why I ended up hitchhiking across country. And then gradually I was sort of able to step back from that and sort of understand those in the context of the time that I was raised in the context of my parents, their own personal history. So, to give those, to find a framework for those things so that it didn't just seem like a series of bizarre events,
And did anyone, after the book came out, did anyone in the book, were they upset by some of the retelling or?
Well, I've had some people who are peripherally involved in the organization. Not that many people from the organization have read it, but I did have somebody who's the spouse of someone who's named in the book be quite upset because she said, well, nobody knew those things were happening. But you can be upset, and that doesn't mean that the story doesn't still need to be told. I mean, I would be upset to be in this book too. Upsetting things happened, of course. So I respect that, but the people that I worked closely with there have been nothing really but supportive about this book. Somebody said to me, you really put a name onto the mistake so big I could never name it, and now it has a name, it has this book, so. And what an honor for somebody to say that to me. I mean, I could never have expected that.
Looking back, how would you describe your childhood now?
Well, I was a kid who was given a lot of choices early on. I think my parents felt like the worst thing they could be was be hypocrites, and so they were, hippies who sort of really embraced that lifestyle, and I think they felt like they were giving me the gift that they hadn't been given because they'd had pretty regimented childhoods. And I took that choice. Now, I obviously was not well prepared to make a lot of those choices. So, I'm, like I say, we hitchhiked across country. I became very involved in radical politics in my teens. So I think it's really a kid who's looking for some meaning, some belonging, some purpose. I really, to me, that was really vital, that I kind of felt a part of something. And things shifted around a lot in my life. So finding what I was going to be a part of, and maybe finding that structure, I think part of what, that involvement in radical politics gave me was a place to be. It gave me some rules, probably for really the first time in my life.
Because you didn't have those with your parents.
Exactly.
Yeah. And now, what was life like living in the commune?
In the commune when I was little, life was pretty chaotic. There could be anywhere between 8 and 20 people living. We lived in a couple of different places. Sort of decisions were all made communally. I don't remember my parents for a big chunk of that, because they were just sort of a group of the adults in that group. But there was a lot of fun. We played music. We were a traveling band for a little while. We were disastrous farmers. Look at the size of this zucchini. Well, they're not supposed to be that big. We really, I think it's, I say in the book, like, we just learned everything the hard way. Yeah. So I think that was that, I think one of the impacts of that was my relationships with my peers, because, we lived in a fairly conservative part of the world in Northern California. So going to school when everyone else is going to church on Sunday, and you're, having naked trampoline parties at your commune, those were really, really different worlds. So maybe negotiating that was probably the toughest part of that, I think.
And your mom was there. What
Yes.
was your relationship like with your mom then?
Well, I had quite a close relationship with my mom once she sort of emerged out of that group of people. Like I say, for a while, she wasn't there for a while. I mean, she was there physically, but in terms of the group, I didn't always connect with her. But I think once she began to come back into my life, she was very interested in education, not necessarily traditional education, but almost everything I know about slavery in the U.S. or the civil rights movement or women's history. Really, I learned from my mom, who was learning those things and very eager to share them with me. So in that sense, she was a very generous, caregiver, because she really wanted me to have all that education that she had not had about the world, and particularly the world of sort of marginalized people.
But was she aware of some of the things that were happening to you, like with Carl?
No, I don't think she was really aware that that her boyfriend was a pedophile. I mean, at least not early on in that. I think also, though, the reality sometimes of women who don't feel like they have a lot of opportunities is maybe people don't ask the questions that they don't want the answers to, So I think maybe, maybe there could have been more awareness on her part. But I think, again, that is a situation that sometimes people find themselves in. Is, he was a good provider in many ways for her. So.
And then you suffered a tragic loss. Can you tell us about Dana?
I did. So my cousin, Dana, was a year and a month younger than me. And her mother, my mother's sister, was quite mentally ill throughout all of her childhood. So we often saw her in the context of sort of being the support system for my aunt, her mother. Halfway houses, things like that. And when she was 15, she took up with a family who had one child and then later had another child. And as it turned out, that man really had this suicide wish, and she lived with them for, I'm not exactly sure, maybe about a year. and they ended up signing a suicide pact and killing themselves in an Arizona motel room. Yeah, when she was only 15, and that was such a pivotal moment for me in my life. Partly because I had no idea sort of what to do with that level of grief and rage. Really, I was really enraged at all of the adults in her life that had not been able to intervene or save her. But also, I had this moment in my family. My mother and my sister and the other members of my family really called that she was murdered because it was this suicide pact and she didn't in fact pull the trigger herself. And I kind of saw that as this choice that she had made. And it's really only later on in my life that I can look at a 15-year-old and say, yeah, that when somebody else pulls the trigger, it's not suicide.
You know what I find interesting is that you are saying in this context, obviously Dana didn't have the choice.
Yes.
She was a child.
Yes.
And then earlier we were talking about choice, and your parents gave you choice.
Yes,
at 8,
exactly. Yes.
Much younger age.
Yes.
Did you ever have any resentment to your parents?
Oh, yeah, of course. I think I did. And perhaps there are still moments when I still do. There's moments where you look at an 8-year-old kid and you just have this sort of image of, whoa, what went on there. At the same time, I think that their goal was really to recognize, well, I think it was twofold. One was to live the lifestyle that they wanted to live, and the other one was to respect this intelligence and this sort of these interests that I had. And for them, those two worked very nicely hand in hand, because here was this, precocious little kid who could say, yeah, I want to do that. And they could say, yeah, we're going to let you do that. So they didn't force me to do anything, but at the same time, it was pretty convenient for them that I was this kid who wanted to do crazy things.
Did you ever think about that maybe what happened to Dana could have happened to you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that was, but maybe not until that moment, really, and maybe not even until later. There was a point in my life where I realized, oh my goodness, I am so lucky. And I don't mean lucky like fortunate, I mean lucky like, whew.
To be alive.
Yeah, all those moments where that could have totally gone, sideways for me. Mm-hmm. So absolutely.
And so you were living in Montreal with your dad for a little bit, and that's probably the closest you had to a normal childhood.
Yeah.
But then after Dana died, you moved to Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that normal a childhood because, my dad was a drug dealer, and there was. He was one of the nice drug dealers, but it was still not, there were secrets in that household, just like there were secrets in my mother's household. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to Brooklyn when I was 16, and I became involved with the organization that my mother had already been involved with in California. Mm-hmm. And she was doing sort of field work, a lot of fundraising and food banks and things like that in the community. And I thought when I went to Brooklyn that was the kind of work I was going to be doing. But instead, I ended up living in the safe house of this organization. There were, at peak times, there were 80, 90 people living in this safe house, writing manifestos and memos. And it was a very closed, organization.
What was the name and what was the ideology?
The public face of that organization is called the National Labor Federation, and actually each different field office has their own name. Mm-hmm. And the sort of internal clandestine organization that people were recruited to was the Communist Party USA Provisional Wing, which was supposed to be like the getting things done kind of wing. So they weren't actually officially affiliated with the Communist Party USA.
So here you meet somebody that you refer to the old man.
As the old man, because I didn't really even know his real name until much, much later.
So can you describe him to us?
Oh my goodness. He was quite the character. He was 46 when I met him. I had no idea. So I was 16. I had no idea actually how old he was. He claimed that he had been a United Farm Worker organizer, that he had been part of Cuban revolutionary organization. So he had this whole somewhat mysterious backstory. He was a very charismatic, extremely well-read individual, quite funny, quite engaging in lots of ways. I don't know if you can imagine sort of Harry Dean Stanton as a revolutionary, chain smoker, then maybe that would give you sort of a picture of who he was.
Now, when you met him, you said that, "I know you."
Yeah.
Do you think that was your instincts kicking in, or did you actually know him?
I think it was. I mean, that was a moment that I kept coming back to and thinking about, because I do remember walking into that office, and he wore this incredibly powerful Paco Rabanne perfume, and he was dressed in this sort of gangster suit, and I just had this moment of just going, whoa. But then I thought, I don't know where else to go. I don't know really what else is going to give my life purpose. I was kind of getting involved in drugs in Montreal, and I just thought, I can't be as free as I am, and I really need something to give my life to, and he was more than happy to take it, really. So
how did he treat you?
Well, at first he treated me very well. I mean, he was very, again, flattered me with, all of his talk about how precocious and intelligent I was. And then gradually that became, we went from this intellectual relationship to this, sexual relationship, but this sort of more intimate relationship. And so I ended up being one of the group of women who was sort of his caretaker, bringing him his, soup and his coffee and his cigarettes. And that also kind of felt like a privilege, even though it was a bit of a surprise at first. There was also this moment where I just felt like, well, here I am being useful in the world, and here's this genius, and as I say in the book, he's this finicky machine that we just have to keep running, because he had many health problems, and he was always saying, I could die tomorrow, and we were always worrying over him so that he wouldn't.
Do you think at one time in the book he says there's no justice, just us?
There's just us, yes.
Do you think he sensed that, that about you, that you needed somebody like him?
Oh, I mean, I think he sensed that, he had conned many, many more women before me, so he really had a routine down. I think he was very good at that. But yes, absolutely. I think that he took women in particular, I think, who felt sort of too smart for their own good, honestly, is kind of the way I can describe it. Women that felt like they had a lot of intelligence to offer, but also didn't really know where to put that.
Or hurt women, maybe.
Yes.
Who had been hurt.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Well,
Why did you
but they were tough, though. I mean, they weren't only victims.
It seemed like he was attracted to strong women, and because it seemed like it was a challenge to kind of bring them to what he wanted, to make them into what he wanted.
Yeah, and then, that wasn't hard, because he was a guy, first of all, when I went to Brooklyn, he knew everything about me. I mean, he knew about my cousin dying. He knew about, that I'd been molested. So he had all that story, that really all these things that were secrets before, that I'd never really talked to anyone about. That's all we talked about for the first while, was just my life. And so I kind of gave that over to him in a way. And then he started kind of giving that back to me in his own interpretations, right? So instead of being that vulnerable little kid, crossing from Quebec to California, maybe I was kind of this Lolita kid, and maybe there was a reason why these things why creepy men kept hitting on me, because maybe there was something in me that I wasn't even aware of. And so he really shaped those stories to a narrative that worked for him, right? So.
Now, you were there for 3 years.
Yeah.
Why did you finally decide to leave?
Well, because I went there sort of prepared to, if I figured, if I'm going to die young, I want to die for a purpose. I don't want to be this random, newspaper death like my cousin had been. And at a certain point I realized, oh, but I would be that. I really would just be, I don't think that this goal of revolution that he has is going to work. Never mind whether or not I think it's a good idea. I just don't think, I think this is a bit of a con. And even then, for a few months, I was like, well, okay, but if he wants to kill himself, I'll go with him. And then at a certain point, I thought, oh, well, no, I'm not just dying for a man. I'm not dying for love. And I don't even know if I do love him. And also I would turn 19, and I just thought, I can't get old here.
We're going to show a picture of you.
That's me. Not long after I got out of the organization, sort of trying to rediscover who I was and all of that.
When you look at that picture, what do you think? What do you feel?
Oh, she's so tough. And not tough all at the same time. I admire that. I think I was just coming from feeling very wounded to feeling like I was a survivor in some ways, and so I embrace that. What
happened to the old man?
Oh, he lived for a lot longer. He lived for another 11 years, and he died of congestive heart failure, I think, in the end, which might be a euphemism for, a drug overdose, because he was on a lot of painkillers, so... Yes, so there he is. Apparently that tombstone is like over 6 feet tall. So, and it's quite grandiose in its wording. So,
how do you feel about what's on the headstone?
I think he probably wrote that himself. Honestly, he had a pretty choreographed life in some ways. I think there's no question that he is, the beloved comrade. Even years after, it really took me a long time to not have, I don't know if it's tender feelings, but to not feel connected to him, to be on the other side of that and feel like I didn't have anything to explain or to justify or even really to ask him anymore, But I hope people don't believe it.
And so, well, after you left and you went back to Montreal, you meet somebody and you tell them your story, and they actually say, it sounds like you were in a cult.
Yes, and I was very resistant to that.
Why? Why were you resistant to that term?
Why? Because, because I didn't really associate cults with being political. And I really felt like, well, no, I wasn't. I was a dedicated soldier and, in a revolutionary struggle. So that's the way I wanted to see myself. I certainly didn't want to see myself as someone who had been duped or tricked. I wanted to see myself as someone who was, courageous and.
But you are.
Well, yeah, but I don't think we always associate people who get caught up in those kinds of movements and cults as being courageous or even smart. We think, I don't know, that they're stupid, and I don't think that's, I think that goes back to what I was saying before. You don't ask the questions if you don't want to know the answers in a way, and I think when people are wounded, sometimes they don't always they can't afford to ask questions beyond just the path that they've chosen. So
now the book is called Red Star, and I see the Red Star tattoo. You did get it.
I did get it. I did. I had somebody say, why would you want like an actual physical reminder of that? And I think, I'm not ashamed of the things that I tried to do. They weren't successful, and thank goodness they weren't successful. I mean, honestly, sometimes your mistakes are the best. It's good that things didn't work out.
Why did you call the book Red Star Tattoo?
Because I think writing this book was really this process of transforming something that felt like a scar into something that felt like something as beautiful as I could make it. I mean, you can't always transform pain into beauty, but something that I could say, I took part in creating this. This wasn't only done to me. This was, this is the interaction between sort of skin, desire, and mind, kind of. And also many of the people originally in the organization had Red Star tattoos, and I had wanted one and then never got one while I was there. So,
Do you think that we romanticize the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s?
oh, yes, I really do. I think people don't realize how dark and scary that was, particularly for children, but I would say also for women. I mean, free love, really was a bit of a problem for a lot of women. I think a lot of women thought they were getting some kind, liberation, and really what they were getting was lack of protection, really from male desire or and yeah, not having a framework to decide what did they really want, right?
And now you're working with youth in Vancouver?
Yes, yes, and again, I see those parallels, and probably that's just my framework. But when a kid gets involved in a gang, or if they can get involved in extremism, I think those are all the same. I think that's all on the same spectrum of taking young people who are vulnerable, who want the world to be simpler than it is, who have a lot of pain that they don't know what to do with, and saying, I will give you some answers. I will give you something to do with that pain. And that, people are pretty volatile. I mean, when they have that impetus, I think. So.
Sonja Larsen, thank you so much for writing this. I've marked it up so much. I think I'm going to be tweeting all these things for the next year or so. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.